The Grand Liberty Ballroom glittered like a diamond in Boston's evening skyline. Crystal Waterford chandeliers cast prismatic light across Italian marble floors that had been polished to a mirror shine. Outside, a row of limousines and luxury sedans deposited the city's wealthiest citizens at the entrance. Bankers, surgeons, real estate magnates, old money Bostonians with names that appeared on university buildings and hospital wings. This wasn't just any charity event. The Veterans Liberty Foundation Gala commanded a $500 per plate donation, the kind of exclusivity that ensured only those with significant means could attend. The walls were adorned with American flags and military service banners, their rich colors a stark contrast to the black-tie formality of the attendees, who largely had no personal connection to what the flags represented. Near the entrance, encased in burnished mahogany and glass, sat a framed letter from the president himself, congratulating the foundation on its noble mission to establish the Veterans Liberty Center, soon to be Boston's premier facility for returning servicemen and women. The letter, like much of the decor, served more as impressive set dressing than a testament to genuine commitment. At the center of the ballroom stood a magnificent Steinway Model D concert grand piano, its ebony surface gleaming under the chandeliers. A small, tasteful plaque at its base proudly proclaimed American craftsmanship, one of the few remaining luxury items still manufactured on U.S. soil. The piano waited silently, a 9-foot giant prepared for the professional pianist scheduled to perform later in the evening. The air hummed with a particular sound of wealth, ice clinking in crystal tumblers, the subtle rustle of silk gowns worth thousands, and conversation conducted at precisely the right volume to be engaging, but never crass. These were people accustomed to being heard without having to raise their voices. James Harrington, the 48-year-old chairman of the fundraising committee, moved through the crowd with practiced ease. His tailored tuxedo fit without a single wrinkle, his Rolex Presidential glinting at his wrist, a $40,000 timepiece that most veterans could live on for a year. Harrington Development was etched into Boston's skyline with luxury condominiums that had replaced once affordable neighborhoods. His father, State Senator Harrington, stood nearby, receiving deference from all who approached. "Another fantastic turnout, James," said Senator Harrington, clapping his son on the shoulder. "The foundation couldn't ask for a better chairman." James nodded, accepting the compliment as his due. "We've already secured commitments for $3 million tonight, and we haven't even started the official program." What remained unspoken between them was the mysterious $10 million donation that had made the entire project possible. An anonymous benefactor whose identity was known to nobody in the room, not even James himself. Near the kitchen entrance, Sarah Miller balanced a tray of champagne flutes with practiced precision. At 26, she moved with the efficiency of someone working her way through graduate school. This job at Boston's premier catering company helped pay for her studies in social work at Boston University. Her grandfather's service in Vietnam had inspired her master's thesis on PTSD treatment in combat veterans. "Miller, Peterson," the catering manager hissed, "Table 7 needs refreshing. And remember, these people tip the foundation, not you." Sarah nodded, accustomed to Peterson's reminders that she was essentially invisible to the guests. As she navigated between dinner tables, her eyes drifted to her phone in her apron pocket. She had promised to call her grandfather tonight. On his bookshelf at home sat a precisely folded American flag in a triangular case, presented to him at his best friend's funeral, another Vietnam veteran who had lost his long battle with the war's invisible wounds last year. The gentle hum of refined conversations suddenly faltered near the grand archway entrance. Like a wave receding from shore, a silence spread across the ballroom, pulling attention toward the unexpected disruption. There, standing just inside the entrance, was a figure that seemed transported from another world entirely. An elderly man, perhaps in his early 70s, stood straight-backed despite his years. He wore a faded olive-green M65 field jacket, the kind issued to American soldiers during the Vietnam era. The jacket had been mended multiple times, its edges frayed but clean and dignified in its wear. A small, tarnished purple heart pin was still affixed to the breast pocket. His gray hair was neatly combed but cut in a military short style that hadn't changed in 5 decades. More shocking to the assembled crowd was the large German shepherd at his side. The dog was elderly too, its muzzle grayed but its eyes alert and intelligent. Around its neck was a worn collar with military tags. Not standard dog tags, but something custom-made. The animal stayed perfectly at heel, disciplined and watchful. The contrast could not have been more stark. This weathered soldier and his loyal companion, standing amid Boston's elite, a living monument to service in a room where service primarily meant charity galas and tax-deductible donations. "Sir, I'm sorry, but you can't." Peterson started toward the intruder, but was intercepted by a younger man in a security uniform. "It's all right," said the security guard, Sam Wilson, a 35-year-old Afghanistan veteran who had recognized something in the older man's bearing immediately. "I've got this." Instead of escorting the visitor out, Sam approached with respect. "Evening, sir. Can I help you?" The older man's pale blue eyes, the kind that had seen things most in this room couldn't imagine, fixed on Sam's face. Recognition passed between them, the unspoken brotherhood of those who had worn the uniform. "Name's Bill Hayes," the man said, his voice a gravelly baritone weathered by age and perhaps by years of shouting orders above the sound of helicopter rotors. "This is Max. He goes where I go." Sam noticed a slight tremor in Bill's right hand. Not fear or age, but the telltale sign of nerve damage, common among veterans. "Afghanistan, 10th Mountain," Sam said quietly, identifying himself. "USMC Khe-Sanh," Bill replied simply. Sam straightened almost imperceptibly. Even for a younger veteran like himself, Khe-Sanh was legendary. The 77-day siege where Marines had held out against overwhelming North Vietnamese forces. Without another word, Sam stepped aside, giving the older Marine passage. By now, the disruption had drawn James Harrington's attention. He approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to solving problems with money or influence. "Excuse me," James said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone addressing a subordinate. "This is a private event. I'm afraid you'll need to leave." Bill Hayes didn't flinch under James's imperious gaze. Instead, those faded blue eyes studied the younger man with the careful assessment of someone who had evaluated threats under far more pressing circumstances than a charity gala. "I saw your flyers downtown," Bill said, his voice steady. "Veterans Liberty Foundation. Thought I might see what it's all about." James's lips thinned with annoyance. "We'd be happy to send you information about our services once the center opens, but tonight is a fundraising event for major donors." Several guests had gathered to watch the exchange, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity. Sarah Miller, still holding her tray of champagne, found herself moving closer, drawn by something in the old Marine's dignified stance. "I didn't come for services," Bill said. His eyes moved past James to the magnificent Steinway piano at the center of the room. "I came because I heard music might be involved. Always had a fondness for piano." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the onlookers. The idea that this shabby old man might have anything to contribute to an evening of cultural refinement struck them as absurd. "Look," James said, his patience visibly wearing thin, "this really isn't the place." "Can I play it?" Bill interrupted, nodding toward the piano. "For food, I mean. A meal for me and Max here. We haven't eaten properly in a couple of days." The request hung in the air, so unexpected and inappropriate that it momentarily silenced even James Harrington. Then someone near the back let out a sharp, derisive laugh. Others joined in the kind of laughter that comes not from humor, but from the relief of tension. Here was something they understood: a homeless veteran looking for a handout, a familiar stereotype they could dismiss. James recovered, a slow smile spreading across his face as he recognized an opportunity to entertain his guests. "You want to play our Steinway? That's a $180,000 instrument, sir." "I'll be gentle with it," Bill replied, his expression unreadable. James turned to the crowd, now fully embracing his role as its impromptu master of ceremonies. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have an unexpected audition tonight." His voice carried the unmistakable tone of mockery dressed as magnanimity. "Our friend here believes he can entertain us in exchange for dinner." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some laughed openly, others shifted uncomfortably, and a few older attendees looked away, entirely unwilling to witness the humiliation that seemed inevitable. Colonel Thomas Grant, a 75-year-old Vietnam veteran who had built a successful defense consulting firm after his service, watched the scene with growing discomfort. Unlike most in attendance, he wore his military service quietly but proudly. A small pin on his lapel, the only visible indication of his silver star, and 3 Purple Hearts. Sarah Miller felt her cheeks burn with secondhand embarrassment, not for Bill, but for the crowd's reaction. The old Marine's dignity in the face of their mockery reminded her powerfully of her grandfather. Actually, James continued, warming to his role. Let's make this interesting. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a money clip thick with $100 bills. $2,000 says you can't move anyone in this room to tears with your playing. That's in addition to your meal, of course. The crowd murmured, recognizing the cruelty masquerading as charity. $2,000 was pocket change to James Harrington, but the gesture allowed him to position himself as generous while setting up the old veteran for failure and humiliation. James, Colonel Grant said quietly, a note of warning in his voice. But his objection was lost in the growing spectacle. Bill Hayes showed no reaction to the insulting offer. He simply nodded once and began moving toward the piano, Max padding silently at his heel. The crowd parted before him, some moving back as if his poverty might be contagious. Be careful with that instrument, Peterson called out nervously. That piano is worth more than... He stopped himself, but everyone understood the implication, worth more than you. As Bill approached the Steinway, his gait changed subtly. The slight stoop in his shoulders straightened. His steps became more measured, more deliberate. Those with military experience might have recognized the transformation. This was a man moving back into his element, a soldier approaching a mission with confidence born of experience. Max settled at the foot of the piano as Bill eased himself onto the bench. His hands, which had seemed weathered and trembling moments before, hovered over the keys with unexpected poise. In the quiet that descended upon the room, Bill Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, and in that brief stillness, seemed to go somewhere else entirely. Perhaps back to another time, another place where music had meant something far different from entertainment at a charity gala. 4 hours earlier, in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Dorchester, Bill Hayes had stood before a small wooden cabinet in his living room. The cabinet doors were open, revealing not a television or stereo system, but a shrine of sorts. A precisely folded American flag in a triangular case, a Marine Corps emblem, a shadow box containing the Purple Heart and Bronze Star medals, and a faded photograph of young Marines' arms around each other's shoulders, standing before a battle-damaged church in Vietnam. Max, graying but still alert, lay on a worn rug nearby, watching his master's familiar ritual. The German Shepherd had been rescued from a shelter 6 years ago, a retired military working dog with no place to go after service. The two veterans had recognized something in each other immediately. The quiet understanding of those who had stood watch, who had sacrificed, who carried invisible wounds beneath visible scars. Bill carefully picked up a newspaper clipping and read it again, though he had memorized every word. Anonymous donor gives $10 million to Veterans Liberty Foundation. The article detailed plans for Boston's newest and most comprehensive Veterans Support Center, scheduled to open in the coming year. It would offer mental health services, job training, housing assistance, and community for returning service members. A noble cause. But Bill Hayes had seen too many noble causes corrupted by self-interest, too many charities that served their administrators better than those they claimed to help. He had watched fellow Marines struggle with bureaucracy more deadly than enemy firefighting for benefits they had earned with blood. "What do you think, Max?" he asked, his voice softer in private than the gruff baritone he presented to the world. "Should we see what these people are really made of?" Max's ears perked up at his name, brown eyes fixed on his master with complete devotion. Bill reached into the cabinet's bottom drawer and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside was another Purple Heart. Not the one in the display case, but one he had kept separate for reasons known only to him. He slipped it into the pocket of his field jacket. "Tonight we find out if they care about veterans," he told Max as he scratched behind the dog's ears, "or just about looking like they care." Now sitting at the Steinway in the Grand Liberty Ballroom, Bill's fingers hovered above the keys for what seemed an eternity. The room had gone completely silent, 200 guests waiting for the inevitable disaster. The discordant plunking of an amateur, the confirmation of their superiority. James Harrington had taken a seat at the nearest table, a front row view for the entertainment he'd orchestrated. His smile was smug, anticipatory. Senator Harrington stood behind his son, a hand on his shoulder, pleased with James's handling of the situation. Then Bill Hayes pressed a single key, G, middle of the keyboard. The note that emerged from the Steinway wasn't the tentative plink of an uncertain hand. It was perfect, resonant, controlled with a depth of tone that only comes from someone who truly understands the soul of the instrument. The note hung in the air, crystalline and pure, commanding attention, not through volume, but through precision. Bill held the note for several seconds, letting it vibrate through the room, allowing its purity to reset expectations. When he finally lifted his finger, the silence that followed was different, no longer anticipatory, but stunned. "Just a lucky strike," James muttered to his father, but doubt had crept into his voice. Bill's hands settled fully onto the keyboard, now no longer hovering but taking rightful possession. His left hand established a gentle rolling bass pattern, while his right began to weave a simple but haunting melody. It wasn't Chopin or Beethoven or any of the classical pieces the audience might have expected. It was something else entirely, something that sounded like it had been born in the hills of Appalachia, but refined through years of technical discipline. The piece began quietly, almost tentatively, like a question being asked. There was an American quality to it. Open spaces in the harmonies, a plain-spoken honesty in the melody that avoided European ornamentation. As Bill played, his technique revealed itself subtly. Perfect control of dynamics, immaculate pedaling, the kind of legato phrasing that takes decades to master. Sarah Miller found herself transfixed, her tray of champagne forgotten in her hands. Colonel Grant leaned forward in his seat, his brow furrowed in concentration. Even Max seemed to respond to the music, his ears perked, forward, his eyes never leaving his master. As the piece developed, Bill added complexity, counter melodies that intertwined with the main theme, harmonic shifts that created emotional tension, then released it. His hands, which had appeared weathered and shaky moments before, now moved across the keyboard with the assurance of an artist who had spent thousands of hours in practice. The melody itself seemed to tell a story. It spoke of wide open spaces of brotherhood, of loss. There was something elegiac about it, a requiem for things, or people, now gone. Yet underneath ran a current of resilience, of endurance despite unimaginable hardship. James Harrington's smug smile had vanished, replaced by confusion and the first flickers of concern. This wasn't how the story was supposed to unfold. The homeless veteran was meant to embarrass himself, not demonstrate mastery. "He must have had some lessons once," James whispered to his father, trying to diminish what they were witnessing. "Probably played in a church somewhere." The music swelled, now Bill's hands moving faster, the melody climbing to an emotional peak before resolving into a gentle, mournful conclusion. The final notes lingered in the air like a question left unanswered, or perhaps like the echo of a last conversation cut short. When Bill finally lifted his hands from the keyboard, the silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the audience collectively held its breath, uncertain how to reconcile what they had just heard with the man who had produced it. Bill turned slightly on the bench, his eyes finding Colonel Grant in the crowd. Something passed between the two veterans, a recognition perhaps, or a shared memory. "That piece," Bill said, his voice carrying in the silence, "is called Requiem for Echo Company. I wrote it for Captain Michael Johnson, Echo 6 we called him, and the men who didn't come home from Khe Sanh." Colonel Grant's face had gone pale. The name Khe Sanh acted like an electric current through his body, stiffening his posture, sharpening his focus on the man at the piano. "We were pinned down at LZ Bravo," Bill continued, speaking as if only to Grant. "3 clicks from the fire base. Captain called in a fire mission on our own position. Only way to stop them from overrunning us." He knew what it meant for himself. The military terminology, LZ, clicks, fire mission, meant little to most in the room, but Grant understood every word. These weren't terms one picked up from movies. They were the language of men who had been there. "The dust-off couldn't get to all of our wounded," Bill added softly. "So at night I'd play for them, on an old upright in what was left of the village church. Help them hang on till morning." Colonel Grant stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Bill's face. "I was with the 26th Marines at Khe Sanh," he said, his voice unsteady. "We heard stories about a piano player on the western perimeter. They called him just a corporal with a hobby." Bill cut him off, turning back to the keyboard. "Nothing special." But Grant wasn't deterred. "They called him the Ghost of Hill 881, he said louder now. "Because after the NVA shelling, he'd be the first one out playing music for the wounded, like a ghost that couldn't be killed." A murmur ran through the crowd. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had begun as cruel entertainment was transforming into something else entirely, something sobering and unexpected. James Harrington felt control of the situation slipping away. This was supposed to be his event, his moment of philanthropic glory. Now people were looking at this homeless veteran with something approaching respect. Well, that was certainly interesting, James said, rising from his seat and attempting to reclaim the attention of the room. Perhaps we should. I'm not finished, Bill said quietly, his hands already returning to the keys. If you don't mind. Before James could object, the first thunderous chords of Chopin's Revolutionary Etude crashed through the ballroom. The contrast with the previous piece was shocking. Where Requiem had been contemplative and elegiac, this was pure fire, a torrent of notes that required virtuosic technique to master. Bill's hands became a blur across the keyboard. Arpeggios cascaded up and down the piano, double octaves, hammered out the melody, cross-hand techniques executed with flawless precision. This was playing that belonged on the concert stage, not in a shelter or on a street corner. It was playing that took decades of discipline and training, playing that revealed not just talent, but genius. The Revolutionary Etude was no random choice. Composed by Chopin during the Polish uprising against Russian rule, it was music born of righteous anger, of resistance against oppression. In Bill's interpretation, it became a statement, a declaration that he would not be diminished by the expectations of those who saw only his worn jacket and aging face. Sarah Miller stood transfixed, tears streaming down her face, her tray of champagne long forgotten. Colonel Grant watched with a mixture of awe and dawning recognition, pieces of a puzzle slowly fitting together in his mind. Even Max seemed to respond to the music's power, sitting more erect, his head held high as his master played. Throughout the audience, reactions varied. Some sat in stunned silence. Others whispered urgently to their neighbors. A few surreptitiously pulled out phones, searching for information. The name Ghost of Hill 881 spread through the crowd like wildfire, along with another name that had begun to surface in their searches, William Bill Hayes. James Harrington stood frozen, his face a mask of confusion and growing dread. This was no longer amusing or pathetic. It was, what, miraculous, impossible, or something more calculated? Senator Harrington leaned down to whisper in his son's ear. James, something's not right here. This man is no ordinary homeless veteran. James nodded mechanically, his eyes never leaving Bill's hands as they commanded the Steinway with undeniable authority. A memory surfaced, himself at 18 watching CNN coverage of the Gulf War from the comfort of his father's study. The same day the senator had made a phone call, ensuring his son's college deferment would be processed without issue. James had felt relief then, but something else too, a vague, nameless guilt that he had buried beneath layers of entitlement and rationalization. As Bill Hayes brought the Revolutionary Etude to its thunderous conclusion, the ballroom erupted in spontaneous applause, not the polite, measured applause of society events, but genuine, awestruck appreciation. Several people were on their feet. Colonel Grant stood ramrod straight, his hand reflexively moving towards a salute before he caught himself. Bill acknowledged the response with a slight nod, but his expression remained serious, focused. He had not come here for applause. The test, his test of them, was still underway. Max looked up at his master, then scanned the room as if assessing potential threats. The German shepherd's presence suddenly seemed less peculiar and more fitting, a warrior attending a warrior. Mr. Hayes, Colonel Grant said, approaching the piano, it would be an honor if you would tell us more about your service, and perhaps about what happened on Hill 881. A shadow crossed Bill's weathered face. Some stories are best left in the past, Colonel. I disagree, Grant replied firmly. Some stories need to be told, especially when they've been buried too long. Grant turned to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we may be in the presence of someone extraordinary tonight. During the siege of Khe Sanh, there were stories among the Marines about a corporal, a piano prodigy who had enlisted instead of attending Juilliard. They said he would play for the wounded when medevac couldn't reach them, that his music kept men alive through the night. The room had gone completely silent again, all attention focused on Grant's words. During an attack on Hill 881 South, Grant continued, his voice thick with emotion. This corporal reportedly carried 3 wounded Marines to safety under heavy fire. On his fourth trip out, he was hit by sniper fire and presumed killed in action. His body was never recovered. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Grant's eyes locked with Bill's. His name was Corporal William Hayes. A collective gasp spread through the ballroom. Sarah Miller had begun recording on her phone, instinctively understanding she was witnessing a moment of historical significance. James Harrington felt the floor tilting beneath him, his carefully orchestrated evening spinning wildly out of control. Bill neither confirmed nor denied Grant's account. Instead, he turned back to the piano one final time, his fingers finding the keys with the familiarity of old friends. "This last piece," he said softly, "is for the ones who made it home but never really came back." The notes that emerged were gentle, luminous, Debussy's Clair de Lune. If the revolutionary etude had been fire, this was pure water, flowing, cleansing, healing. Bill played with such tenderness that the music seemed to hang suspended in the air, defying gravity and time. It was the sound of moonlight on still water of peace after unimaginable conflict of beauty that somehow survives in a world of destruction. As the familiar melody unfolded, transformed by Bill's interpretation into something both ancient and new, tears began to flow freely throughout the room. Not just from those with military connections who understood the subtext, but from anyone with a heart to hear what the music was truly saying. Sarah Miller thought of her grandfather and his precisely folded flag. Colonel Grant remembered faces of men 5 decades gone. Even James Harrington felt something crack within his carefully constructed facade, a hairline fracture in the wall he had built between himself and authentic emotion. Max rested his muzzle on his paws, watching his master with unwavering devotion as the music washed over the assembly. The old German shepherd seemed to understand that something momentous was unfolding, that a truth long buried was finally coming to light. As Clair de Lune approached its general conclusion, Bill Hayes looked out across the ballroom at the faces of Boston's elite, bankers, surgeons, politicians, heirs to fortunes, and saw something he had not seen when he entered humanity. The music had stripped away pretense and pretension, leaving only the shared experience of being moved by beauty. The final notes faded into silence, a silence so profound it seemed almost holy. No one moved, no one spoke. The world outside the ballroom ceased to exist for those moments as the last vibrations of the Steinway strings gradually stilled. Bill Hayes sat motionless at the piano, his hands now resting in his lap, his shoulders straight, his head held high. Gone was any trace of the supplicant who had entered asking for food. In his place sat a man of undeniable dignity and presence, a soldier, an artist, a survivor. Colonel Grant was the first to break the silence. He stepped forward and in full view of everyone rendered a perfect military salute to the man at the piano. "Welcome home, Corporal Hayes," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Welcome home at last." The words hung in the air in acknowledgement not just of Bill's physical return from Vietnam decades ago, but of his return from the wilderness of anonymity and neglect that too many veterans endured. It was the recognition that had been decades overdue. One by one, other veterans in the room, most of them far younger than Bill, stood and saluted as well. A Gulf War Marine, an Iraq War Army sergeant, even Sam Wilson, the security guard who had let Bill enter. James Harrington remained frozen in place, the weight of what was happening slowly sinking in. This homeless veteran he had attempted to humiliate was actually a Medal of Honor recipient, a musical genius, a living legend among those who understood what service truly meant. And James had tried to use him as entertainment. The test, Bill's test of the Veterans Liberty Foundation and its leadership, was reaching its inevitable conclusion, and James Harrington had failed catastrophically. As the implications crashed over him, James felt something unfamiliar. Not just embarrassment or social discomfort, but genuine shame. For perhaps the first time in his privileged life, he stood exposed, his character weighed and found wanting, not by peers he could impress or authorities he could influence, but by a true measure of human worth. Bill Hayes rose slowly from the piano bench, Max immediately at his side. The transformation was complete now. No hint remained of the shuffling supplicant who had entered asking for food. This was a Marine standing at attention, a man who had looked death in the face and carried on, a survivor, whose dignity could not be stripped away by poverty or neglect or the contempt of those who had never served. "I believe," Bill said, his voice carrying easily through the silent room, That you owe me a meal, Mr. Harrington, and perhaps something more. He reached into the pocket of his field jacket and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a Purple Heart medal, its purple and gold surface catching the light from the chandeliers. And now, Bill continued, his eyes fixed on James, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about the Veterans Liberty Center, about who it's really meant to serve, and about who should be leading it. The first act of Bill Hayes' test had concluded. The music had revealed truth, stripped away pretense, and prepared the ground for what was to come. The second act, the reckoning, was about to begin. The velvet box containing the Purple Heart medal rested in Bill Hayes' weathered palm like a silent accusation. Light from the chandeliers caught its surface, sending purple and gold reflections dancing across faces now frozen in collective shock. The medal, awarded only to those wounded or killed in combat, was an unmistakable symbol of sacrifice that rendered James Harrington's $2,000 mockery even more grotesque in retrospect. The ballroom had fallen into a silence so complete that the soft padding of Max's paws could be heard as the German shepherd repositioned himself at his master's side. The loyal canine's posture had changed subtly. Head higher, ears, alert stance, protective, as if he too sensed the shifting power dynamics in the room. That first piece I played, Bill said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silence, wasn't just any composition. It was written in a bunker at a caisson after we lost half of Echo Company in a single firefight. Colonel Grant took a step closer to the piano, his military bearing unmistakable despite his civilian attire. I remember that day, he said, his voice thick with memory. April 14, 1968. NVA artillery opened up at dawn, followed by a human wave attack from the North Ridge. Bill nodded once the briefest acknowledgement. Captain Johnson had us pinned down at the western perimeter. Radio was hit. No way to call for air support. The captain knew we were overrun unless someone made it back to the main firebase. As he spoke, Bill's right hand returned to the piano keys, not playing fully, but offering quiet, sparse notes that underscored his words like a musical pulse beneath the narrative. Each note seemed to mark a footstep, a heartbeat, a moment of decision from that distant day. 3 volunteers tried to break through the NVA lines, Bill continued. One made it past the first 100 yards. His fingers found a mournful minor chord that hung in the air. Captain Johnson called for his radio man's gear. Said he was going himself. We all knew it was suicide. Bill's left hand joined his right on the keyboard, adding depth to the impromptu soundtrack of his memories. That's when I stepped forward instead. Sarah Miller felt tears welling in her eyes as she recorded this living history on her phone. Around her, the gala guests stood transfixed. Champagne flutes, forgotten social posturing, temporarily abandoned in the face of authentic heroism. You were just a corporal, Grant said, his voice revealing deep respect. A piano player assigned to special services. No one would have expected you to volunteer. Bill's hands created a rolling, urgent pattern on the keys. I was faster than the captain, youngest in the unit, and I knew the terrain from previous reconnaissance. The music intensified, matching the gravity of the memory. I took the radio and slipped out through a drainage culvert, made it halfway to the firebase before they spotted me. Took rounds in my left shoulder and side, but kept moving. His hands on the piano demonstrated what his words described, the right hand carrying forward relentlessly, while the left faltered, then recovered. Called in the coordinates for an airstrike, then started back for the others. The music beneath his words became fragmented, chaotic, capturing the disorientation of battle. NVA sniper caught me about 20 yards from our position. Shot went through my neck. Bill's right hand unconsciously moved to a faded scar partially visible above his collar. Last thing I remember was helicopter rotors and being dragged by my boots. His fingers struck a dissonant chord that gradually resolved into something peaceful, if melancholy. Woke up 3 weeks later in a field hospital in Okinawa. By then, they had already reported me KIA. Medal ceremony for my family had already happened back home. Colonel Grant's military discipline cracked slightly. My God, he whispered. You're really him. Throughout this exchange, James Harrington had remained frozen, his face drained of color. The implications were crashing over him in waves. He had attempted to humiliate a Medal of Honor recipient, a living legend, a man who had nearly given his life for his country, while James' own father had ensured his son would never face such dangers. When I recovered enough to travel, Bill continued, I had a choice to make: return home to a hero's welcome, or his hand stilled on the keys, or disappear. Colonel Grant finished for him, understanding immediately. Start fresh without the weight of everyone's expectations. Bill nodded. After what I'd seen, what I'd done, I couldn't face being paraded around as some kind of hero. Couldn't stand the thought of giving speeches about patriotism to people who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. Senator Harrington stepped forward, now political instincts awakening to the public relations disaster unfolding before him. Mr. Hayes, what you've endured is unimaginable. The country owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Perhaps we could, with all due respect, Senator, Bill interrupted, his tone hardening. I didn't come here for platitudes, and I certainly didn't come for pity. The older Harrington fell silent, unused to being cut short, but recognizing that this was neither the time nor place to assert his authority. Bill's attention returned to the younger Harrington. I came to understand who was leading this new Veterans Liberty Center, to see if the people in charge truly understood what service means, what sacrifice costs. James swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Mr. Hayes, I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Had I known who you were— That's precisely the problem, Bill cut in, his voice like flint striking steel. You treated me differently when you thought I was just a homeless veteran asking for a meal. Your true character was revealed when you believed I had no power, no status, nothing to offer you. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The social hierarchy of the room had been completely upended. The wealthiest guests, those who had laughed the loudest at Bill's initial request, now looked profoundly uncomfortable. Character, Bill continued, his eyes sweeping the room, is what you do when no one important is watching, when there's nothing to be gained, when kindness costs you something. At the edge of the gathering, Sarah Miller felt a surge of admiration for this man whose values aligned so closely with what her grandfather had taught her. Veterans like her grandfather had returned home to a nation that preferred to look away from their suffering, that found their trauma inconvenient, that thanked them for their service with words, but failed them with actions. If I may, Colonel Grant interjected, addressing the room, there's more to this story that you should all understand. Grant moved to stand beside Bill, the two veterans presenting a united front. The Ghost of Hill 881 wasn't just any Marine who happened to play piano. Before enlisting, William Hayes was considered one of the most promising young pianists in America. He had been accepted to Juilliard on full scholarship. This revelation sent another shockwave through the audience. The contrast between what might have been and what had become was stark and sobering. When the war escalated, he could have claimed an educational deferment. Instead, he volunteered. Grant's voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what that choice had meant. He traded Carnegie Hall for combat, and when his tour was supposed to be over, he extended twice because his unit needed him. Bill's expression remained impassive, but Max seemed to sense his master's discomfort with the praise. The German shepherd pressed his body closer to Bill's leg in a gesture of solidarity. After he was presumed killed, the story of the piano player who saved Echo Company became legend among Marines. Grant continued. His Medal of Honor citation is still required reading at officer candidate school. James Harrington felt increasingly cornered. Every word from Grant's mouth further highlighted the chasm between Bill's sacrifice and his own protected existence. The 2,000 in his pocket, intended as a humiliating gesture of superiority, now felt like 30 pieces of silver. I believe, Bill said, returning the Purple Heart to his pocket, it's time for me to show you who I really became after Vietnam. Without further explanation, he turned back to the piano. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment, then descended with decisive purpose. The music that emerged was unlike anything he had played before, not a classical piece or a folk melody, but something that seemed to bridge worlds. It had elements of Americana jazz harmonies, classical structures, and something indefinably modern. The composition was complex, yet accessible, technically demanding, yet emotionally direct. This is American Elegy, Bill said as he played, his voice carrying over the music. I composed it for the opening of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in 1982. The revelation landed like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just any composition, it was a famous piece that had been performed by the National Symphony Orchestra, that had been recorded multiple times, that was played annually at Memorial Day ceremonies. Music critics had called it one of the most significant American compositions of the late 20th century, and its composer, long a mystery to the public, was sitting before them in a worn field jacket, having been mistaken for a homeless man. Several guests had pulled out their phones quickly, confirming what seemed impossible. The mysterious W.H., credited with American Elegy, was indeed William Hayes, a composer who had never given interviews, never appeared at premieres, never claimed the fame that was rightfully his. As the piece built to its emotional climax, Sarah Miller felt tears streaming freely down her face. The music spoke of loss, but also resilience of darkness, but also dawn of a nation wounded but healing. It was patriotism without bombast, remembrance without glorification, hope without naivete. Colonel Grant stood at rigid attention, lost in memories of fallen comrades. Several other veterans in the room had similar reactions, some with heads bowed, others staring into middle distance, all transported back to moments of brotherhood and sacrifice. Max watched the room with alert eyes, occasionally glancing up at his master with unmistakable pride. The German shepherd trained to detect threats seemed to understand that the battlefield had changed, but the mission continued. His master was still fighting, still serving, just in a different way. As American Elegy reached its conclusion, the ballroom remained utterly silent except for the music. Bill Hayes had completely transformed the atmosphere of the gala from superficial charity to profound reflection. No one moved. No one spoke. Many wept openly, including some who had laughed at his entrance. When the final notes faded, Bill didn't acknowledge the stunned reaction. Instead, he addressed James Harrington directly. After Vietnam, I needed solitude, time to heal. I returned to music, but wanted no public recognition. I started a small business restoring pianos, taking broken instruments, and making them whole again. A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. Perhaps it was symbolic. James remained silent, his customary confidence shattered. This entire evening had spiraled beyond his control, revealing truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. That small restoration shop grew into Hayes Musical Instruments. Bill continued, we now manufacture concert grands that compete with Steinway, Bosendorfer, and Fazioli. We employ over 200 people at our factory in Pennsylvania, more than half of them veterans. The name Hayes Musical Instruments sent another shock through the room. The company was renowned in musical circles for its innovative designs and exceptional craftsmanship. Their pianos were played in concert halls worldwide. Our newest model, Bill added with subtle irony, sells for approximately $210,000, somewhat more than this Steinway. James Harrington looked physically ill. The man he had offered to feed like a stray dog was not just a war hero, but a successful entrepreneur whose company's annual revenue likely exceeded Harrington Development's. But I didn't come here to discuss my business ventures, Bill said, his tone sharpening again. I came because of this. He withdrew a folded newspaper clipping from his jacket, the same article he had studied in his apartment hours earlier. Anonymous donor gives $10 million to Veterans Liberty Foundation, Bill read aloud. A significant contribution that will make the new center possible. A tense silence fell over the room. Even those who had been moved by Bill's music and story couldn't immediately grasp the connection. That anonymous donor, Bill said quietly, is me. The confession landed like a grenade in the center of the ballroom. Gasps echoed across the marble floor. Senator Harrington's political smile froze in place. James looked as though he might collapse. I've spent 40 years avoiding public recognition, Bill continued, but I've never stopped serving my fellow veterans. Hayes Musical Instruments channels 30% of its profits into veterans' causes. We provide job training, housing assistance, PTSD counseling, and adaptive instruments for wounded warriors. He fixed James with a steady gaze. So when I learned about plans for the Veterans Liberty Center, I wanted to help. But I needed to be certain the leadership understood what veterans truly need, that they respected the men and women who served regardless of their current circumstances. Colonel Grant nodded in understanding. You were testing us. Yes, Bill acknowledged. And specifically, I was testing Harrington here as chairman of the fundraising committee and presumptive director of the new center. All eyes turned to James, who stood rigid with humiliation. His entire carefully constructed persona, the successful businessman, the philanthropist, the community leader, had been systematically dismantled over the course of an hour. The test was simple. Bill said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. How would you treat a veteran who appeared to have nothing to offer? Would you see his humanity, his dignity? Would you honor his service regardless of his current circumstances? The question hung in the air, its answer already painfully evident to everyone present. You failed, Mr. Harrington, Bill stated flatly. You didn't just fail, you turned a veteran's request for basic dignity into entertainment for your wealthy friends. James opened his mouth to defend himself but found no words. What defense could there be? The evidence of his character had been witnessed by 200 of Boston's most influential citizens. Bill turned his attention to the broader audience. I've seen this pattern too many times. People who view veterans as props for photo opportunities, who use our sacrifices to advance their careers, who claim to support the troops, but cross the street to avoid a homeless vet. His words struck home. Many in the room had the grace to look ashamed, recognizing their own complicity in a system that celebrated warriors then abandoned them once they were broken. It's why I established one condition when I made my donation, Bill continued. The foundation board must have final approval of the center's leadership, a condition that Senator Harrington assured me would be a mere formality. Senator Harrington's political instincts finally kicked in. Mr. Hayes, I can assure you that the board will take your concerns very seriously. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss privately that can't be said here. Bill interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Transparency is precisely what's needed. He rose from the piano bench, standing tall despite his years. Max immediately fell into position at his side, the two veterans presenting a united front. Effective immediately, Bill announced, I am exercising my contractual right to veto James Harrington's appointment as director of the Veterans Liberty Center. The declaration hung in the air like a judge's verdict. James visibly flinched as if struck. His father's hand gripped his shoulder, whether in support or restraint wasn't clear. Furthermore, Bill continued, I'm recommending that Colonel Thomas Grant be appointed in his place, a combat veteran who has demonstrated both military leadership and business acumen is precisely what this center needs. Colonel Grant straightened, surprised but composed. I would be honored to serve Mr. Hayes if the board agrees. They'll agree, Bill said with quiet certainty. My remaining $5 million depends on it. The room erupted in whispers. The initial $10 million, it seemed, was only half of Bill's intended contribution. The financial leverage he wielded was substantial enough to ensure his recommendations would be followed. For James Harrington, this public removal was devastating. His father's expression had hardened into a mask of political calculation, already considering how to minimize the damage to the family reputation. This is absurd, James finally sputtered, finding his voice. You can't just walk in here and... I believe I just did, Bill replied evenly, but perhaps you'd like to challenge my decision. We could put it to a vote right here. Ask everyone who witnessed your character tonight whether they believe you're the right person to serve veterans. James glanced around the room, seeking allies and finding none. Even his closest associates averted their eyes, unwilling to side with the man who had so thoroughly misjudged the situation. You know nothing about me, James said, desperation edging into his voice. One mistake doesn't define a person's entire character. True, Bill agreed, but it can reveal it. And frankly, Mr. Harrington, I've seen enough. With the leadership question seemingly settled, Bill turned his attention elsewhere. His eyes found Sarah Miller still standing at the edge of the gathering, phone in hand, tears drying on her cheeks. Young lady, he called, the one who wanted to help when everyone else was laughing. Come here, please. Sarah moved forward hesitantly, conscious of the hundreds of eyes now following her progress across the ballroom. As a catering server, she was accustomed to being invisible in these settings. Now she stood in the spotlight, her worn black uniform in stark contrast to the designer gowns surrounding her. What's your name? Bill asked, his tone gentler than it had been with the Harringtons. Sarah Miller, sir. Her voice quavered slightly. I'm just a server. No one is just anything, Bill replied. I saw your face when Mr. Harrington was mocking me. You were the only staff member who looked troubled by it. Sarah swallowed. My grandfather was in Vietnam, 3rd Marine Division. He never really recovered from what he saw there. Bill nodded in understanding. And now, I'm studying social work at Boston University, she said, focusing on trauma treatment for veterans. My thesis is on innovative approaches to PTSD therapy. A small smile crossed Bill's weathered face. Including music therapy, perhaps? Sarah's eyes widened. Yes, actually, how did you know? Because true healing requires more than medications and talk therapy, Bill said. It needs connection, purpose, a bridge back to what made us human before the war tried to take that away. Max nudged Bill's hand with his muzzle, a subtle reminder of his presence. Bill absently stroked the German shepherd's head, the gesture revealing years of companionship. The Veterans Liberty Center will need staff who understand this, Bill continued. People with both academic training and personal connection to veterans' experiences. Sarah's breath caught as she began to understand where this was heading. How much student debt have you accumulated so far? Bill asked directly. The question would normally have been inappropriate, but the evening had long since abandoned conventional social rules. About 60,000, Sarah admitted. Plus another year to go. Bill nodded as if this confirmed something. The Hayes Foundation will cover your remaining tuition and existing loans in exchange for a 2-year commitment to work at the Liberty Center after graduation, as Director of Community Outreach and Therapeutic Programs. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Hayes, I don't know what to say. Say you'll honor your grandfather by helping others like him, Bill replied simply. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes again. Yes, of course, yes. The exchange had been witnessed by everyone, creating yet another stark contrast to James Harrington's behavior. Where he had offered humiliation masked as charity, Bill had provided genuine opportunity without condescension. Bill turned next to Sam Wilson, the security guard who had allowed him entry. You too, son. Afghanistan, you said. Sam stepped forward, standing at a natural position of respect. Yes, sir. 10th Mountain Division. 2 tours. And now you're guarding doors for minimum wage plus tips, Bill observed. Making use of your training. Sam's expression remained professional, but something flickered in his eyes. Not really, sir, but it pays the bills while I figure things out. Bill exchanged a glance with Colonel Grant, who nodded in understanding. The Liberty Center will need a security director, Grant said. Someone who understands both protection protocols and the veterans will be serving. Someone who won't escalate situations with those who might be struggling. Sam straightened, the possibility of meaningful work clearly appealing. I'd be interested, sir. Good, Bill said. You start when the center opens. Colonel Grant will discuss salary and benefits, but I can promise it will be substantially better than your current position. The pattern was clear now. Bill Hayes wasn't just removing ineffective leadership. He was actively building a team that understood veterans' needs from personal experience. He was creating a community of service. Throughout these exchanges, Max remained vigilant at Bill's side, occasionally scanning the room with alert eyes. The German shepherd's presence had initially seemed odd in the formal setting, but now felt entirely appropriate, a symbol of the unconditional loyalty so often found between veterans and their service animals. As if reading the room's thoughts, Bill rested his hand on Max's head. Max here was a military working dog in Iraq and Afghanistan, 3 combat deployments. When he was retired from service, they were going to euthanize him because he was too aggressive for civilian adoption. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. The truth was, Bill continued, Max was suffering from the canine equivalent of PTSD. Loud noises triggered him. He was hypervigilant. He had trouble sleeping, sound familiar to anyone who served in combat zones. Several veterans in the audience nodded in recognition. I adopted him 6 years ago. We recognized something in each other immediately, 2 old warriors trying to find peace. Bill's voice softened. He saved me as much as I've saved him. Max looked up at his master, unwavering devotion in his brown eyes. The Liberty Center will include a service dog training program, Bill announced, pairing veterans with animals who've also served. Healing happens both ways in those relationships. The vision for the center was expanding before everyone's eyes, from a basic support facility to a comprehensive healing community designed by someone who truly understood veterans' needs. Throughout this extraordinary scene, James Harrington had remained rooted in place, watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. His humiliation was complete. His authority stripped away, his character judged and found wanting by someone whose moral authority was unimpeachable. Mr. Harrington, Bill said, turning his attention back to James, I believe you owe me something." James blinked in confusion, then remembered the wager. With trembling fingers, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the money clip holding $2,000. As he extended it toward Bill, his hand was visibly unsteady. Bill made no move to take the money. "I don't want your money, Mr. Harrington. I want accountability." James froze, uncertain what was being asked of him. "I want you to give that money to Miss Miller here," Bill clarified. "Not as charity, not as pity, but as payment for a wager fairly won. I believe several people in this room were moved to tears by my playing, which satisfies the terms you set." The demand was precise and pointed, forcing James to acknowledge Sarah as an equal worthy of respect, not just as a server to be ignored or commanded. With no graceful alternative, James turned and extended the money to Sarah, who accepted it with quiet dignity. "Thank you," she said simply, neither groveling in gratitude nor rejecting the gesture with pride. Her response highlighted the contrast between true grace and James's performative magnanimity. Bill turned back to the piano one final time, his fingers finding the keys with familiar ease. He began to play softly, not a formal performance now, but a gentle underscore to his final words. "I've spent most of my life avoiding recognition," he said as he played, preferring to serve quietly to help rebuild lives broken by war. "But tonight reminded me that sometimes the most important service is visibility, standing up to be counted, using whatever influence you have to ensure others aren't forgotten." The music beneath his words was contemplative, threading through his speech like a river through a landscape. "Look around this room," Bill continued, "at the wealth, the power, the privilege. None of it inherently wrong, but all of it carrying responsibility. While men and women who served this country sleep under bridges. While veterans wait months for mental health appointments. While suicide claims 20 of our brothers and sisters every day." His eyes swept the room, challenging each person present. "You cannot call yourselves patriots if you step over homeless veterans on your way to fundraising galas. You cannot claim to support the troops if you abandon them once they're broken. You cannot wrap yourselves in the flag while forgetting those who bled to defend what it represents." The music grew more complex beneath his words, adding emotional depth to his challenge. "Tonight wasn't just about exposing one man's character," Bill said, glancing briefly at James. "It was about asking all of you to examine your own, to question what service truly means, to consider what you owe to those who gave everything for this country." As he spoke, the entire ballroom remained transfixed. This was no longer entertainment or even charity. It was a reckoning, a call to genuine action rather than performative generosity. "The Veterans Liberty Center will open in 6 months," Bill announced, his music creating a foundation beneath his words. "It will serve any veteran who walks through its doors, regardless of appearance or circumstance. It will prioritize dignity over bureaucracy, healing over paperwork, community over statistics." His eyes found Colonel Grant. "And it will be led by people who understand, who have walked the same path, who have felt the same pain." Grant nodded solemnly, accepting both the honor and the responsibility being placed upon him. "As for this piano," Bill said, his hands still moving across the keys, "I'd like it donated to the center when it opens, placed in the main lobby where anyone can play it. Music belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford gala tickets." The suggestion, more of a directive given his leverage, was met with murmurs of approval. The Steinway would serve as both a practical instrument and a symbol of the evening's transformation. Bill's impromptu composition began to wind down, finding resolution in a series of gentle chords. As the final notes faded, he stood and faced the room one last time, Max immediately at attention by his side. "I came here tonight looking for evidence of character," he said simply. "I found it, both its presence and its absence. The Veterans Liberty Center deserves leadership that embodies the values our service members fought to defend: courage, integrity, sacrifice, and compassion." He turned to Colonel Grant and extended his hand. "Colonel, I'm entrusting you with making this vision a reality." Grant clasped Bill's hand firmly. "I won't let you down, Corporal, or any of our brothers and sisters." The use of Bill's former rank, corporal, rather than Mr. Hayes, the wealthy businessman, was deliberate and meaningful. It acknowledged that in some fundamental way, we remain who we were in our moments of greatest trial. Bill then turned to Sarah Miller and Sam Wilson. "You two represent the next generation of service, different, battlefield, same mission. Take care of our people. Both nodded solemnly, accepting the charge with appropriate gravity. Finally, Bill faced James Harrington, who still stood frozen in humiliation. For a long moment, Bill simply studied him as if weighing something in his mind. "Mr. Harrington," he said eventually, "I hope tonight has taught you something valuable, something that will stay with you longer than any position or title would have." Without waiting for a response, Bill gave a slight nod to the room at large, not quite a bow, but an acknowledgement of conclusion. Then he turned and began walking toward the exit, Max padding silently beside him. As they passed through the grand archway where they had entered, Bill Hayes didn't look back. He had accomplished what he came to do. He had tested character and rendered judgment. He had ensured that those who would lead the center understood what service truly meant. The Ghost of Hill 881 had completed one final mission. Behind him, the ballroom remained in stunned silence, 200 of Boston's wealthiest citizens confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves and their relationship to those who had sacrificed for their freedom. Some would forget by morning, returning to lives of privilege untouched by reflection. Others would write larger checks, salving their conscience with donations. But for a few, Colonel Grant with his new purpose, Sarah Miller with her opportunity, Sam Wilson with his meaningful work ahead, the night would mark a genuine turning point. A reminder that character revealed in crisis is character indeed. And for James Harrington, standing alone despite the crowd around him, the lesson was perhaps the most profound of all, that true worth is measured not by the clothes we wear or the wealth we display, but by how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. As the grand doors closed behind Bill Hayes and his faithful companion, one chapter ended and another began. The Veterans Liberty Center would rise not as a monument to charity, but as a testament to service that continued long after the battlefield was left behind. The forgotten pianist had ensured he would not be the last veteran to be remembered. The cool Boston night air embraced Bill Hayes and Max as they stepped out of the Grand Liberty Ballroom. Bill paused on the sidewalk, inhaling deeply, allowing the tension of the evening's performance to dissipate. Max pressed against his leg, a familiar, comforting pressure that had steadied him through countless difficult moments over the years. "Well, old friend," Bill murmured, scratching behind the German shepherd's ears. "Mission accomplished." Max looked up at his master with unwavering devotion, as if understanding perfectly the significance of what they'd just done. The German shepherd's muzzle had grayed with age, but his eyes remained alert and intelligent, a warrior's vigilance that mirrored Bill's own. Bill glanced back at the hotel's illuminated facade. Inside, he knew the ripples of his appearance were still spreading outward, transforming what had begun as just another charity gala into something far more consequential. It had been a calculated risk, stepping back into the spotlight after decades of deliberate anonymity. But some battles couldn't be fought from the shadows. They began walking toward Boston Common, Bill's pace unhurried but purposeful. Despite his 72 years, he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned to conserve energy through long marches and extended operations. Max matched his rhythm perfectly, the two veterans in complete synchronization. The park was mostly empty at this hour, its pathways illuminated by historic lampposts that cast pools of warm light across America's oldest public green space. Bill found a bench beneath a massive oak tree, its branches spread wide like protective arm. He sat with a slight sigh, the accumulated tension of the evening's performance finally finding release. Max settled at his feet, alert, but relaxed, his graying muzzle resting on his paws, while his eyes continued to scan their surroundings. Old habits died hard for both of them. Bill reached into the inside pocket of his field jacket and withdrew a small leather case. Opening it revealed a simple silver harmonica, not an expensive instrument, but well used and cared for. It had been his companion through 2 tours in Vietnam, small enough to carry in a breast pocket, capable of providing moments of solace amidst chaos. He raised it to his lips and began to play softly, a gentle blues progression that merged with the ambient sounds of the city. The music wasn't for an audience now. It was a private communion between himself, his memories, and the peaceful night. As he played, Bill's thoughts drifted to the young people he'd just set on a new path: Sarah Miller, with her compassion and academic training; Sam Wilson, with his quiet strength and hard-earned wisdom. They represented what he had always believed in, that each generation had the capacity to learn from previous mistakes to build something better than what came before. His harmonica shifted to a different melody, one with distinctly Appalachian roots. that spoke of resilience through hardship. His fingers, so recently demonstrating virtuosic skill on the Steinway, now coaxed simpler, but no less meaningful notes from the modest instrument. After several minutes, he lowered the harmonica and returned it to his pocket. His hand then moved to the purple heart metal he'd shown earlier, fingers tracing its familiar contours through the fabric. 56 years, he whispered almost to himself. 56 years since Khe-Sanh. Max's ears perked up at the sound of his master's voice, brown eyes reflecting unwavering loyalty. Bill gazed up at the stars barely visible through Boston's light pollution and the oak's sprawling canopy. Somewhere up there, he liked to think Echo Company was watching. Captain Johnson, Rodriguez, Tanner, Williams, all the others who hadn't made it home. The men whose memory had driven him forward when it would have been easier to surrender to bitterness or despair. Still serving boys, he whispered to the night sky. Different battlefield, same mission. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a rare intrusion of modern technology into his otherwise old-fashioned existence. The screen showed a message from Colonel Grant. "You've created quite a stir here. Senator Harrington is already making calls." Bill frowned slightly. He had expected political pushback, but not quite so quickly. The Harrington family had deep connections throughout Massachusetts. Their influence extended into government contracts, zoning boards, regulatory agencies, all potential pressure points that could be used against the Veterans Liberty Center before it even opened its doors. He typed back, "Keep me informed. We may have won the battle, but the war isn't over." As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, a distant memory surfaced, a lesson from his first squad leader in Vietnam. In guerrilla warfare, Hayes, the sergeant, had told him, "Never assume the enemy is defeated just because they've retreated. That's usually when they're at their most dangerous." Bill stood suddenly restless. "Come on, Max, we've got work to do." The German shepherd rose immediately, ready as always for whatever mission lay ahead. Together, they walked back toward the city streets, two old warriors preparing for one more campaign. 3 weeks later, the Boston Globe's front page carried the headline, "Anonymous Donor Revealed the Ghost of Hill 881 and His 15 Million Veterans Center." The article featured a grainy photograph that had been taken during the gala bill, at the piano, his weathered hands commanding the keyboard with unmistakable authority. The piece detailed his heroism at Khe-Sanh, his presumed death, his subsequent successful business career, and his decades of anonymous philanthropy. Most damaging of all, it mentioned the address of his modest Dorchester apartment. Bill tossed the newspaper onto his kitchen table where Colonel Grant sat nursing a cup of black coffee. Max lay at Bill's feet, sensing the tension in the room. "Who leaked it?" Bill asked, his voice carrying the controlled calm that had served him well under artillery fire. Grant shook his head. "Hard to say for certain. 200 people at that gala. Any one of them could have talked to the press. But not just anyone would have known my address," Bill pointed out. "That narrows it down considerably." "The Harringtons," Grant suggested, not needing to elaborate further. Bill nodded once. Bam. "Makes sense, classic countermove. If you can't stop the project target, the man behind it." The article represented exactly what Bill had spent decades avoiding: public recognition, media attention, the loss of the privacy that had allowed him to heal on his own terms. Now, with the Veterans Liberty Center preparing to open in 4 months, his cover was blown. The carefully constructed shield between William Hayes, the businessman, and Corporal Hayes, the Medal of Honor recipient, had been shattered. "We've already received calls from 3 national news programs," Grant reported. "2 publishers have inquired about book rights, and there's a Hollywood producer who wants to—" "No," Bill cut him off firmly. "No interviews, no books, no movies. Nothing changes about our mission." Grant studied his old comrade with concern. "Bill, this changes everything. The press will be all over the center now. Every veteran who walks through those doors will be scrutinized. The very privacy we promised them could be compromised." Bill stood and began pacing, a habit from his days commanding a platoon when difficult decisions needed to be made. Max's eyes followed him, the dog's head turning in perfect synchronization with his master's movements. "Then we adapt," Bill said finally. "We adjust our tactics to meet the new battlefield conditions." "What do you have in mind?" Bill paused at the window, looking out at the Boston skyline. "The Harringtons wanted to make this personal. Fine. Let's make it personal, but on our terms, not theirs." He turned back to Grant, his pale blue eyes holding the same determined focus they had shown at Khe Sanh when he volunteered for what should have been a suicide mission. It's time to call in every favor we're owed. Every veteran-owned business in Massachusetts. Every military family. Every service organization. I want a show of force that will make the Harringtons think twice about getting in our way. Grant's expression shifted from concern to determination. The old Marine straightened in his chair, responding instinctively to the command presence that Bill Hayes had never truly lost. "Consider it done, Corporal," he said, using the old rank deliberately. "What else?" "We need to neutralize their political leverage," Bill continued. "Senator Harrington has friends on the zoning board, the licensing commission, the health department, anywhere that could throw obstacles in our path. I know a few journalists who'd be interested in investigating those connections," Grant offered, "particularly in the context of trying to obstruct services for veterans." Bill nodded. "Good, and we need to secure our financial position. The $15 million I've committed will get us operational, but we need to establish an endowment that can't be threatened or undermined." "I can reach out to some of my old business associates," Grant said. "Several of them are veterans themselves. They'd understand what we're trying to accomplish." As they strategized, Bill's phone rang, a Boston area code, but not a number he recognized. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Hayes," said a familiar voice. "It's James Harrington." Bill's expression hardened. "Mr. Harrington, I was just reading about myself in the morning paper. Interesting coincidence." There was a pause on the line. "That's why I'm calling. The article wasn't my doing, or my father's." "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect anything," James replied, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "But it's the truth. My father and I had a significant disagreement after the gala. About you, about the center, about a lot of things." Bill exchanged a skeptical glance with Grant, who had moved closer to listen. "Go on," Bill said. "I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about what happened that night," James continued. "About what you said regarding character, about how I behaved. It's not who I want to be." The words sounded genuine, a man struggling to articulate a difficult realization. Bill had heard similar tones from young Marines facing their first real test of courage. "What exactly are you saying, Mr. Harrington?" "I'm saying I want to help," James replied. "Not as chairman, not as the face of anything. Just help, because it's the right thing to do, and because I need to prove to myself more than anyone that I'm capable of seeing value in people regardless of what they can offer me in return." Bill covered the phone's microphone. "What do you think?" he asked Grant. The colonel shrugged. "Could be sincere, could be a ploy to get inside information. Only one way to find out." Bill nodded and returned to the call. "Mr. Harrington, I appreciate the sentiment, but trust is earned, not declared. If you truly want to help, I'll give you that opportunity, on a probationary basis." "That's fair," James agreed immediately. "More than fair considering. Meet us at the Armory building in the South End tomorrow at 9 a.m. That's where the center will be located. We're starting renovations, and there's plenty of physical labor to be done." The silence that followed suggested James was processing the implications: manual labor, rather than a boardroom position, a test of humility, rather than an opportunity for recognition. "I'll be there," he said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." After the call ended, Grant raised an eyebrow. "You really think he's changed?" Bill gazed out the window again, remembering countless young men he'd watched transform under the crucible of combat, some rising to the occasion, others crumbling under pressure. "Everyone deserves the chance to become better than they were," he said softly. "The question is whether they're willing to do the work required. We'll see if James Harrington is." The old Armory building in Boston's South End stood as a testament to American military history, a castellated red brick fortress built in 1891 that had housed National Guard units for decades before falling into disuse. Its high ceilings, expansive drill floor, and multiple outbuildings made it ideal for the Veterans Liberty Center's purposes, but years of neglect had taken their toll. When James Harrington arrived the next morning, dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt, he found Bill Hayes and Colonel Grant already at work. Both men wore faded jeans and work shirts, their hands protected by well-worn gloves as they cleared debris from what would eventually become the center's main entrance. Max lay in a patch of sunlight nearby, watching the proceedings with alert interest. The German shepherd raised his head when James approached, a low growl rumbling in his chest, until Bill patted his side reassuringly. "Good of you to come, Mr. Harrington," Bill said, straightening up. At 72, he moved with the deliberate care of a man who understood his body's limitations but refused to be defined by them. "Hope you brought gloves." James held up a pair of brand-new leather work gloves, the price tag still attached. "I, stopped on the way." Grant suppressed a smile. "First time doing manual labor." James had the grace to look embarrassed. "Is it that obvious?" "Only completely," Grant replied, but his tone held more amusement than mockery. "Don't worry, everyone starts somewhere." For the next several hours, James worked alongside the two veterans, hauling debris to a dumpster, pulling out rusted nails and scraping decades of paint from window frames. By noon, his designer shirt was soaked with sweat. His hands were blistered despite the gloves, and his carefully styled hair was plastered to his forehead. Bill watched him without comment, noting that the younger man never complained, never checked his phone, and never suggested calling in professionals to handle the work. When James struggled with a particularly stubborn section of flooring, he simply adjusted his approach and tried again, showing unexpected persistence. During a brief lunch break, sandwiches and bottled water brought by Sarah Miller, who was working on program development in another part of the building, Bill finally addressed what was on everyone's mind. "The newspaper article," he said, studying James's reaction. "If it wasn't you or your father, who do you think leaked the information?" James took a long drink of water before answering. "My father has many allies in Boston politics, people who would see helping him as an investment in their own future." "But you specifically said it wasn't him," Grant pressed. James nodded. "Because he told me so directly. And whatever else he might be, my father doesn't lie to family. He considers it inefficient." "But you think someone acted on his behalf?" Bill asked. "Without explicit instructions?" James considered this carefully. "It's possible. My father has cultivated relationships where people anticipate his needs. Sometimes actions are taken with the understanding that he would approve without him having to actually request them." "Plausible deniability," Grant observed. "Exactly," James agreed. "It's how the game is played in certain circles." "And what's your role in that game now?" Bill asked directly. James set down his sandwich, meeting Bill's gaze with unexpected steadiness. "I don't know yet. I've spent my entire life playing by those rules. It's disorienting to question them." The honesty of the response surprised Bill. He had expected polished deflection or rehearsed contrition, not this raw uncertainty. Perhaps there was more to James Harrington than he had initially judged. "Well," Bill said finally, "while you figure it out, there's a floor that needs sanding. I suggest starting at the far corner and working your way toward the door." James nodded, accepting both the task and its implicit message. Actions would speak louder than words. As they returned to work, Sarah pulled Bill aside. "Do you really trust him?" she asked quietly, nodding toward James. Bill watched the younger Harrington awkwardly maneuvering a floor sander, determination evident in every line of his body. "Trust is earned through consistent action over time," he replied. "But I believe in the possibility of change. I've seen it too many times to discount it." Even after what he did at the gala. Bill's weathered face softened slightly. "Especially after that. Sometimes it takes our worst moments to show us who we don't want to be." Over the following weeks, a remarkable transformation began taking place. The Armory building, long abandoned to dust and decay, gradually revealed its potential. Walls came down, new spaces took shape, and the vision for the Veterans Liberty Center became increasingly tangible. More surprising was the transformation in James Harrington. He appeared every day, trading his designer wardrobe for work clothes, learning construction skills from the veteran volunteers, and slowly earning a grudging respect from those who initially viewed him with suspicion. Bill observed this evolution with cautious optimism. He had seen men change under pressure before, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. The real test would come when James was confronted with a choice between his new principles and his old world. That test arrived sooner than expected. 6 weeks after renovations began, Bill arrived at the Armory to find a city inspector placing an official notice on the front door. The document cited multiple code violations and ordered all work to cease immediately. "What's the meaning of this?" Bill demanded, approaching the inspector. "We filed all the proper permits. Our plans were approved months ago." The inspector, a nervous man in his 50s who wouldn't meet Bill's eyes, shrugged apologetically. Just following orders, sir. There's been a complaint about historic preservation violations. The whole project needs to be reviewed by the Historical Commission. That could take months, Grant protested, joining them at the entrance. We're scheduled to open in 14 weeks. Not my department, the inspector said, already retreating toward his vehicle. You'll need to take it up with the commission. As the inspector drove away, Sarah emerged from the building, her expression troubled. It gets worse, she said. The VA just called. They're reconsidering their agreement to refer veterans to us for services. Something about procedural concerns. Bill's jaw tightened. The Harringtons. It has to be, Grant agreed. This is a coordinated effort to shut us down before we even open. The three stood in silence, contemplating the implications. Without VA referrals, the center would struggle to reach many of the veterans who needed its services most. Without the ability to complete renovations, they couldn't open at all. The carefully planned timeline was unraveling before their eyes. Where's James? Bill asked, suddenly realizing the younger Harrington wasn't on site. He called earlier, Sarah replied. Said he had a family matter to attend to. Bill and Grant exchanged knowing looks. The timing seemed too convenient to be coincidental. I think we've just seen his true colors, Grant said grimly. Bill wasn't so certain. Something about James's transformation had seemed genuine. The humility with which he'd approached unfamiliar tasks, the respectful way he'd interacted with the veteran volunteers, the gradual softening of his formerly entitled demeanor. It didn't track with someone playing a long-term deception. Let's not jump to conclusions, Bill cautioned. We don't have all the facts yet. As if on cue, his phone rang. The screen showed James's number. Mr. Hayes, James said when Bill answered, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. I just found out what's happening. The work stoppage, the VA issue, all of it. It's my father. Are you surprised? Bill asked, keeping his tone neutral. No, James admitted. What surprises me is that I didn't see it coming. I should have known he wouldn't just accept defeat. And which side are you on, Mr. Harrington? There was a pause, then James spoke with unexpected conviction. I'm on the side of the veterans who need this center. I'm on the side of what's right. And I think I know how to fix this, but I need your trust. Trust is earned, Bill reminded him. I know, James acknowledged, and I haven't earned it yet. But right now I'm asking you to extend it anyway, as a tactical necessity. The military framing wasn't lost on Bill. It was a deliberate appeal to his strategic thinking. What do you have in mind? He asked finally. My father is hosting a fundraiser tonight for the governor's re-election campaign. Every power player in Massachusetts politics will be there, including the heads of every commission and department that's suddenly creating obstacles for the center. And I need you to come with me, in uniform, with your Medal of Honor. Bill inhaled sharply. What James was suggesting went against everything he had chosen for the past 5 decades, the anonymity, the quiet service, the rejection of public recognition. You're asking a lot, he said quietly. I know, James replied. I'm asking you to use the very thing you've spent a lifetime avoiding, your status as a war hero. But sometimes the most effective weapon is the one the enemy least expects you to use. Another military metaphor. James was learning to speak Bill's language. It's not just about tonight, James continued. It's about creating such a public association between the Veterans Liberty Center and America's highest military honor that no politician would dare obstruct it. It's about making it politically toxic to stand in your way. Bill was silent for a long moment, weighing the proposal against his deeply held principles. Finally, he asked, what makes you think your father would even let me in the door? He could almost hear James's smile through the phone. Because I'm still a Harrington, and my father would rather suffer your presence than create a scene in front of the governor. Plus, he doesn't know I've figured out what he's doing. The element of surprise is on our side. Let me think about it, Bill said. I'll call you back. After hanging up, he turned to Grant and Sarah, who had been listening intently to his side of the conversation. Well, Grant asked, do we trust him? Bill gazed at the CIA's work order fluttering on the door. Decades of carefully guarded privacy weighed against the future of a center that could help thousands of veterans, his personal comfort against the greater mission. I don't know if I trust James Harrington yet, he said finally, but I do trust that those who oppose us have underestimated what I'm willing to sacrifice for my fellow veterans. Always have. He looked down at Max, who sat watching him with complete faith. "What do you think, old friend? One more mission behind enemy lines." The German shepherd's tail thumped once against the ground, all the confirmation Bill needed. The Harrington estate in Brookline represented old Boston wealth at its most ostentatious, sprawling colonial revival mansion set on manicured grounds, its facade illuminated by a strategically placed lighting that emphasized its grandeur without seeming gauche. A line of luxury vehicles progressed slowly through the gates, depositing Massachusetts' political and financial elite at the entrance. Bill Hayes sat in the passenger seat of James's BMW, acutely uncomfortable in his dress blues. The uniform still fit, though more snugly than it had in 1968. The ribbons and medals on his chest, particularly the pale blue ribbon supporting the Medal of Honor, felt like they belonged to someone else, someone he had left behind in Vietnam. "You don't have to say anything," James reassured him, sensing his discomfort. "Your presence alone will be enough." Max sat in the back seat wearing his service dog vest with military patches. Bill had insisted on bringing him partly for the emotional support the German Shepherd provided, but also because Max's presence would emphasize the veteran identity that was central to their purpose. "Just to be clear," Bill said as they approached the valet stand, "I'm not here to shake hands and tell war stories. I'm here to ensure the Veterans Liberty Center opens on schedule. Nothing more." James nodded. "Understood." As they exited the car, a ripple of recognition passed through the guests waiting to enter. The Medal of Honor was instantly identifiable to anyone with even passing knowledge of military decorations. Whispers spread rapidly. "That's William Hayes, the ghost of Hill, 881, Medal of Honor recipient. Thought he was dead." Senator Harrington stood just inside the entrance, greeting donors alongside the governor. His practiced political smile froze when he saw Bill and James approaching Max, walking perfectly at heel between them. "James," the senator said, his voice carrying a warning that only his son would recognize, "I wasn't expecting you to bring guests." "Father," James replied with deliberate formality, "I'd like to introduce Corporal William Hayes, United States Marine Corps, Medal of Honor recipient and primary benefactor of the Veterans Liberty Center." The governor, a savvy politician with a keen sense for photo opportunities, immediately extended his hand to Bill. "Corporal Hayes, this is an unexpected honor. Your service to our country is beyond measure." Bill shook the offered hand briefly. "Thank you, Governor, though I'd prefer to focus on the service still needed by veterans returning home today." Of course," the governor agreed readily. "The new center in the South End is a wonderful initiative. I understand you're substantially involved." "He's the anonymous donor who contributed $15 million to make it possible," James interjected before his father could change the subject. "Without Corporal Hayes, there would be no Veterans Liberty Center." Senator Harrington's expression remained fixed in its political mask, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "How remarkable, though I understand there have been some regulatory concerns about the project recently." "Yes," Bill said, meeting the senator's gaze directly. "Quite remarkable how those concerns materialize simultaneously across multiple departments, almost as if they were coordinated." The governor glanced between them, sensing the undercurrent of tension. "Regulatory issues with a veterans facility, I'm sure those can be resolved quickly. My office would be happy to help expedite matters." "That's very generous, Governor," Bill replied, not breaking eye contact with the senator, "especially since many of those regulatory bodies answer directly to your administration." The implication was clear. If obstacles were being placed in the center's path, the governor now had political ownership of the problem. With dozens of wealthy donors watching and a Medal of Honor recipient standing before him, there was only one politically viable response. "Consider it done," the governor declared loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I'll have my chief of staff review the situation personally first thing tomorrow. Veterans services should never be delayed by bureaucratic red tape." Several guests nodded in agreement, smartphones already emerging to capture the moment. The governor's press secretary, ever vigilant, had materialized nearby and was frantically taking notes. Senator Harrington's smile had become rigid. "James, perhaps you and Corporal Hayes would like to join me in my study for a moment. A private word." "I think we're fine right here, Senator," Bill replied calmly, "among witnesses." The word choice was deliberate, not guests or donors, but witnesses. It carried the subtle suggestion that whatever the senator might have orchestrated required public accountability. A photographer approached asking if the governor would like a picture with the Medal of Honor recipient. Before Senator Harrington could intervene, the governor had placed himself beside Bill, one hand extended toward the medals on Bill's chest as if drawing attention to them. "Be sure to get the Medal of Honor in the frame," the governor instructed the photographer, and mentioned in the caption that Corporal Hayes is the driving force behind the Veterans Liberty Center. "The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is proud to support this vital resource for our military heroes." Senator Harrington watched helplessly as his carefully constructed obstruction crumbled under the weight of political expediency. No elected official in Massachusetts would dare oppose a project so publicly associated with a Medal of Honor recipient, not if they wanted to keep their office. As the photographer finished, James leaned close to his father. "The work stoppage order will be lifted tomorrow," he said quietly. "The VA partnership will proceed as planned, and any other obstacles you've arranged will disappear. Otherwise, I believe Corporal Hayes might be persuaded to give interviews about the difficulties the center has faced in navigating state bureaucracy." The senator's eyes narrowed. "You've changed, James." "Yes," his son agreed simply. "I have." Bill, observing the exchange, recognized it for what it was: James Harrington's declaration of independence from his father's influence. The final severance wouldn't be immediate or complete, but a line had been drawn that couldn't be uncrossed. Max, who had remained perfectly behaved throughout the confrontation, pressed closer to Bill's leg, as if sensing the mission was nearing completion. "I think we've accomplished what we came to do," Bill said to James. "I'd like to leave now. This uniform has served its purpose." James nodded, understanding both the literal and figurative meaning. They had weaponized Bill's status as a war hero, the very thing he had spent decades avoiding to protect the center. It had been tactically necessary, but not something to be prolonged for comfort or vanity. As they made their way toward the exit, guests approached from all sides, eager to shake hands with the Medal of Honor recipient, to express gratitude for his service to be associated with his heroism. Bill acknowledged them with minimal courtesy, neither encouraging nor rebuffing their attention. One elderly woman stopped him near the door, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My husband was at Khe Sanh," she said softly. "3rd Battalion, 26th Marines. He didn't make it home, but he wrote to me about a piano player who kept their spirits up during the worst of the siege." Bill's stride faltered. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am." "Don't be sorry," she replied. "Be proud. John said your music reminded them what they were fighting for. That beauty could exist even in hell." She pressed something into his hand, a faded photograph of a young Marine in dress blues, his smile confident and untroubled by what lay ahead. "His name was John Tierney," she said. "If you ever play at that new center of yours, would you consider dedicating a song to him?" Bill's throat tightened unexpectedly. "I will, ma'am. You have my word." Outside, the cool night air was a relief after the stifling formality of the fundraiser. Bill loosened his collar as they walked toward the car, the photograph still clutched in his hand. "You okay?" James asked, noticing Bill's uncharacteristic silence. Bill looked him down at the image of John Tierney, forever young, forever a Marine. "I didn't do any of this for recognition," he said quietly. "Not in Vietnam, not afterward, not tonight." "I know," James replied. "You did it because it needed to be done, because someone had to." The simple understanding in those words suggested that perhaps James Harrington had indeed changed, that he had begun to grasp the fundamental concept of service that had guided Bill's life. "Will it work?" Bill asked. "Will your father back off?" James nodded as they reached the car. "He's a politician, first a father second. He knows when a battle is lost. The center is too public now, too associated with military heroism. Opposing it would be political suicide." "And what about you? What happens when your father realizes you've switched sides?" James opened the car door for Max, who jumped into the back seat with surprising agility for his age. "I've spent my entire life being James Harrington, the senator's son. Maybe it's time to find out who James Harrington actually is." Bill studied the younger man with newfound respect. "That's a difficult journey, finding yourself after living someone else's expectations." "I imagine you know something about that," James observed. "Reinventing yourself after Vietnam." Bill gazed at the Medal of Honor on his chest, the nation's highest recognition for valor, a symbol he had hidden from for half a century. "The hardest battle," he said softly, "is the one you fight with yourself." 4 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, the Veterans Liberty Center opened its doors for the first time. The renovated armory had been transformed into a welcoming functional space that honored its military heritage while serving the needs of modern veterans. Large windows allowed natural light to flood the common areas. The layout was intuitive, designed to be navigable for those with physical disabilities or cognitive challenges resulting from traumatic brain injuries. At the center of the main lobby stood the Steinway Model D Concert Grand from the fateful Gala night, positioned not as a showpiece behind velvet ropes, but as a functional instrument available to anyone who wished to play it. A simple brass plaque on its side read, "Music heals what medicine cannot reach. William Bill Hayes, USMC." Colonel Thomas Grant, dressed in a tailored suit with his Marine Corps pin prominently displayed on his lapel, stood near the main entrance, personally greeting each veteran who arrived. Despite his age and considerable wealth, he had embraced the center's leadership with a total commitment of someone embarking on the most important mission of his career. "Welcome home, Marine," he said, shaking hands with a young man who still moved with the distinctive hypervigilance common to recent combat veterans. "We've been waiting for you." Nearby, Sarah Miller, now the center's director of community outreach and therapeutic programs, was conducting an impromptu tour for a group of Vietnam-era veterans. Her grandfather stood among them, his weathered face revealing both pride in his granddaughter and tentative hope about this new resource. The music therapy room is fully equipped with instruments for all skill levels. Sarah explained, her confidence having grown remarkably over the past months. "And yes, we have a drum circle specifically for those who want to work through anger or anxiety. My grandfather can attest to how effective it's been during our pilot sessions." The older Miller smiled shyly, nodding in confirmation. The change in him was subtle but significant. A man who had spent decades isolated by his trauma, now cautiously re-engaging with community. Sam Wilson moved efficiently through the space, his role as security director evident in how he constantly assessed the environment while remaining approachable and respectful. Under his guidance, the center's security protocols had been designed specifically for a population where loud noises might trigger combat responses, where crowded spaces might induce panic, where standard security measures might evoke memories of checkpoints in combat zones. "Morning, Sam," called a middle-aged woman entering with a service dog, a chocolate Labrador wearing a vest identifying it as a PTSD support animal. "Ranger has his interview for the therapy dog program today." Sam greeted them both by name, kneeling briefly to acknowledge the Labrador with appropriate respect for a fellow service member. The center's approach to security, recognizing every visitor as an individual with specific needs rather than a potential problem to be managed, reflected Bill Hayes' vision of dignity above all else. In one corner of the lobby, James Harrington sat with a small group of veterans, walking them through the basics of business registration. His transformation was evident not just in his casual clothing or his newly humbled demeanor, but in the genuine engagement with which he approached his volunteer work. "The LLC structure gives you liability protection while maintaining flexibility," he explained, pointing to a diagram he'd drawn. "For most of you starting small service businesses, that's going to be your best option." The veterans listened attentively, asking practical questions that James answered without condescension. He had found his place at the center, not as a figurehead or donor, but as someone who could translate his business knowledge into practical help for those transitioning to civilian careers. At precisely 10:00 a.m., Colonel Grant moved to the center of the lobby, standing beside the Steinway. The buzz of conversation gradually quieted as people recognized that something ceremonial was about to occur. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grant began, his voice carrying naturally without need of amplification. "Fellow veterans, family members, and supporters, welcome to the opening day of the Veterans Liberty Center." He paused, looking around at the diverse gathering men and women, spanning multiple generations of service from Wabiboutu to Afghanistan and Iraq, representing every branch of the military and every rank from private to general. This center exists because one man refused to accept that veterans should be treated as objects of charity rather than as valuable members of our community with continuing contributions to make. Grant gestured to the piano beside him. William Hayes' vision and generosity made all of this possible. A respectful murmur passed through the crowd. In the months since the gala and the subsequent publicity, Bill Hayes' story had spread through veteran communities nationwide. The ghost of Hill 881 had become something of a folk hero, the combat veteran who had built success without compromising his values who had never forgotten those left behind. And speaking of Corporal Hayes, Grant continued with a smile, I believe he has something special planned for us today. From a side entrance, Bill Hayes emerged dressed not in his Marine uniform, but in simple civilian clothes, khakis, and a button-down shirt that neither hid nor emphasized his military background. Max walked beside him, gray-muzzled but still proud, his service dog vest polished for the occasion. The crowd parted to allow them passage to the Steinway. Veterans of all eras straightened instinctively, offering the subtle gestures of respect that one warrior gives to another, regardless of rank or generation. Bill settled onto the piano bench, Max taking his customary position at his master's feet. For a moment, Bill simply sat with his hands resting lightly on the keys, gathering himself for what would be his first public performance in decades. 56 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. I made a promise to a fellow Marine at Khe Sanh. He was dying and he asked me to play a song for his wife if I made it home. I never found her. Until recently. He glanced toward the lobby entrance where an elderly woman stood watching the widow of John Tierney, who had approached him at the governor's fundraiser. She nodded once, giving him permission to continue. This is for Corporal John Tierney, Bill said, and for all those who never came home, and for those who did come home but brought the war back with them. His fingers descended onto the keys and music filled the space, not the classical pieces he had played at the gala, but something original and deeply American. It had elements of folk traditions, military cadences, church hymns, and jazz progressions, all woven together into a composition that spoke of loss and resilience, of trauma and healing, of the complex mixture of pride and pain that defined the veteran experience. As he played, Bill looked out at the gathered faces, the young Afghanistan veteran still adjusting to his prosthetic leg, the Vietnam-era helicopter pilot whose hands never stopped trembling, the Gulf War nurse who had seen too much death, too young, the recent combat medic whose eyes still darted to exits and potential cover. In each face, he saw reflections of his own journey, the struggle to reconcile who they had been in war with who they needed to become in peace. The music built to a climax that was neither triumphant nor despairing, but something more nuanced, a recognition that healing wasn't about returning to who you were before, but about integrating your experiences into who you would become after. As the final notes faded, Bill remained seated at the piano, his hands now resting in his lap. The silence that followed was profound, not awkward or expectant, but contemplative, as if the entire gathering was collectively processing what the music had expressed. John Tierney's widow was the first to break the silence. She began to applaud, not the polite social applause of charity functions, but the genuine appreciation of someone who had been truly seen and understood. Others joined in the sound swelling until it filled the renovated armory with an affirmation more powerful than words. Bill Hayes rose from the piano bench, acknowledging the response with a slight nod. Max stood immediately, pressing against his leg in a gesture of support and solidarity that transcended the boundary between species. As the applause gradually subsided, Bill spoke once more. The Veterans Liberty Center isn't about charity, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men in combat. It's about community, about purpose, about continuing to serve just in different ways. He gestured to the diverse gathering before him, the staff, the volunteers, the veterans themselves. Everyone here has something to offer. Everyone here has value that extends far beyond their military service. That's what this place recognizes. That's what this place honors. Bill's eyes found James Harrington in the crowd. The younger man stood straight, meeting his gaze with newfound confidence. The journey from entitled heir to humble servant was still in progress, but the trajectory was clear. Sometimes, Bill continued, the most unexpected people show us what service truly means. Sometimes those we judge most harshly become our most dedicated allies. And sometimes the wounds that seem most devastating lead us to our greatest purpose. He looked down at Max, who had remained faithfully by his side through countless dark nights and difficult days. We heal by helping others heal. We find meaning by creating meaning for others. We honor those we lost by living lives worthy of their sacrifice. Bill stepped away from the piano, signaling that the ceremonial portion of the day was complete. It was time for the real work of the center to begin, the counseling sessions, the job training, the peer support groups, the myriad services designed to help veterans navigate the often difficult transition to civilian life. As he moved through the crowd, accepting handshakes and quiet words of thanks, Bill felt a profound sense of completion. The mission he had begun at Khe Sanh to serve his fellow Marines to create moments of humanity amid chaos, to forge connection through music, had come full circle. The ghost of Hill 881 had finally found peace, not by forgetting the past, but by transforming it into something that could help others find their way home. And throughout the Veterans Liberty Center, in ways both obvious and subtle, that spirit of transformation continued. In the music therapy rooms where trauma found expression, in the job training classes, where new skills built new futures, in the quiet conversations between veterans of different eras who recognized in each other's eyes the same struggles, the same resilience, the same enduring humanity. The forgotten pianist had ensured he would not be the last veteran to be remembered. And in doing so, he had composed his greatest work, not on paper, not at the keyboard, but in the lives of those who would continue his legacy of service long after the music faded.